We're here with Dr. Frank Turek of Cross-Examined. You can find him at crossexamined.org. Author of many books, goes on college campuses all around the nation, the country, anywhere he's invited, he's going and representing Christianity, showing why Christianity is true. Now, Frank, you have a book called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Do atheists have faith? Or
Well, it depends on what you mean by faith. The culture's definition of faith is believing something when you don't have any evidence for it. And I think atheists have to have a lot of faith then, because they believe in a lot of things for which I think there's counter evidence. They believe in materialism. I think that things aren't just made of molecules. I think there's an immaterial realm. They think that macroevolution's true. I think there's evidence against that. They think there are no objective moral values. There's nothing more apparent to me that torturing babies for fun is wrong, and yet many of them will deny that.
what would you say if a Christian said, "Oh, well, we don't really need this apologetic stuff and this debating, it's just a waste of time"? What would you say to someone who would say something
Well,
like
I
that?
came to faith by evidence. I came to faith by reading books by Josh McDowell, who was giving me evidence for Christianity. So while some people don't care about evidence, I certainly did. And if you're going to say it's not something we ought to do, number one, you're giving an argument we ought to not give arguments, which I think is self-defeating. Secondly, you're avoiding what the scriptures say or ignoring what the scriptures say, to always be ready to give an answer for the hope that you have, to destroy arguments that are against the Christian faith, to love God with all our heart, soul, strength, and mind. And thirdly, you're ignoring what the Apostle Paul and others did. He reasoned with people to try and show them why Christianity is true. So it just makes sense that we do this, and it's also commanded by the Bible writers and the apostles.
So what would you say to maybe a pastor or a student who may be watching and thinking, maybe they're debating about coming to something like this, or maybe looking into what you're doing? What advice would you give them?
I would say that 75% of young people who go off to college walk away from the church after they leave the church, and the number one reason they do is intellectually they don't know why Christianity is true. And you know why they don't know why? Because we haven't told them why. At the Unapologetic Conference, we try and show people why Christianity is true. They need this information.
Wow. So we have a question from someone online. Tony asked, how do we refute the politically correct idea that all religions are equal and lead to the same God?
They teach contradictory viewpoints about God, world religions do. I mean, you commonly hear people say, well, all religions teach basically the same thing. They teach that we all ought to love one another. Well, actually, that's not true. I mean, Satanism doesn't teach you ought to love one another. Radical Islam doesn't teach you ought to love one another. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, there is a basic moral code in most world religions. That's essentially true. The problem is when people say, oh, all religions teach basically the same thing, you might say, yeah, they do teach you how to love one another. They only disagree on the nature of man, the nature of God, sin, salvation, heaven, hell, and creation. Outside of that, they're exactly the same. No, they differ on the major issues. They agree on the much lesser issues. Now, why do they agree on morals generally, although there are some differences? It's because the moral law is written on everybody's heart. You don't need religion to know that you ought not murder your neighbor. You need God to justify why you ought not murder your neighbor, but everybody intuitively already understands you ought not murder your neighbor, regardless of what religion you're from. So I would say that religions can't all lead to the same place because they don't purport to lead to the same place. They teach dramatically different things about reality and dramatically different things about God, whether they believe in God at all.
So we have an election not too far coming up. Should Christians kind of keep quiet about that kind of stuff? Should they be vocal? I mean, is there shouldn't we just, there's separation of church and state, so we should just kind of stay in the church?
Yeah, separation of church and state has nothing to do with this. First of all, separation of church and state is irrelevant. Whether it's in the Constitution or not is irrelevant. Why? Because we're not talking about legislating religion. We are talking about legislating morality, and everybody tries to legislate a moral point of view, whether they're atheist, Christian, or anywhere in between. And the only question is, whose morality will we legislate? And I don't want to legislate my morality. I don't want to legislate your morality or your morality. I want to legislate the morality, the one Thomas Jefferson said was self-evident. Now that morality comes from God, but you don't need the Bible to know it. It comes from God because God has written the moral law in everybody's heart. So I think we ought to legislate for life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. But notice life is first. Why? The right to life is the right to all other rights. If you don't have life, you don't have anything. Now, you do have liberty, but not if you use that liberty to take another person's life. See, life comes first. So there are things that we have to legislate. And by the way, for those of you out there that don't think politics are important, I ask you to go to North Korea, go to China, go to Saudi Arabia or Iran. You can't do what we're doing right now on this video in those countries. Why? Because legally they've ruled it out. Politically they've ruled it out. Politics affects our ability to even preach and live the gospel. So if for no other reason you have to be involved in politics, it's for that reason right there.
What kind of sources would you recommend on interpreting the Bible when you have some other religions who claim to be Christian who are also using the Bible, maybe like Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses?
Okay. We're teaching a new class at crossexamined.org called How to Interpret Your Bible. And the spine of this class, the central portion of this class, is to point out that whenever you're about to interpret a text, you need to stop. It's an acronym, S-T-O-P. The S stands for the situation. What's the context of the passage? The T stands for what type of literature is it? Is it history? Is it parable? Is it prophecy? Is it poetry? What is it? Because you need to know that in order to interpret it. The O stands for who is the object of the passage? Is it you? Or is it ancient Israel or somebody else? And P stands for, is this passage prescriptive or descriptive? Because that makes a difference as well. And so whenever you're looking at a passage, you need to stop and figure out what the passage means. If you do those four things, situation, type, object, and prescriptive or descriptive, you should be able to figure out what the meaning of the passage is. Now, if you're having trouble disagreeing with somebody who believes that the passage teaches something else, for example, say a Jehovah's Witness or some other group that has a different view of the Christian scriptures, I recommend you get a book that my co-author wrote called there's a couple of versions of it. I think it's called When Cultists Ask by Norman Geisler and Ron Rhodes. They went through all these different scriptures where other supposed Christian groups take a different interpretation than the traditional Orthodox one, and they give a corrective in that book. So that's a very helpful book. But most of that you can do on your own. Stop. Situation, type, object, and prescriptive or descriptive.
Oh, it's very nice. So that kind of brings me to another question then. Let's say someone's like, well, I'm not as maybe well-read as someone else, or I'm not as smart or funny as Frank Turek or Shai. You know, can they be involved in apologetics, or where would they start for something?
No, it's only for superstars. Everybody can be involved in apologetics. It's a body. Now, people have different gifts and abilities, so not everybody's going to be equally good at everything, right? Where maybe you're good at something, somebody else isn't as good, but they're better at something than you are. And that's why Paul says the body comes together and makes a full-orbed church, a body that can go out there and disciple people. So while everybody might not be William Lane Craig or Norman Geisler or Ravi Zacharias, everybody can know some arguments as to why Christianity is true and then be able to share that with the people they know. Look, you and you out there are going to reach people that others can't. Ravi's not going to reach maybe people that you know, but you will reach them. And Ravi's going to reach people that you might never meet either. That's why, again, it's a body. So everybody should know something about apologetics and why Christianity is true and be able to share it with the people that they meet.
Awesome. And one of the things I'd like to do is point people in a direction where they can start, a resource they can pull from. If people wanted to know more about what you did or get to know where you're speaking at next or just find more information about Cross-Examine, where can they go?
Crossexamined.org, or even better yet, get the crossexamined.org app. We've got right now, there's over 180,000 people have downloaded it. They're finding it helpful. It has our TV shows streamed on there. It has our podcast there. It also has a quick answer section. So you might be having a discussion with somebody over lunch and they bring up an objection to Christianity and maybe you're not quite sure how to answer it. All you need to do is take out your iPhone, your Droid, or if you're one of the 9 people in the world with a Windows phone, it works on that too. And you can get an answer as the person is talking. So wow. This is a very helpful little app that people are finding useful. So download the Cross-Examined app. 2 words in the App Store, Cross-Examined, and the website is crossexamined, all one word, .org.
Awesome, Frank. Well, thank you so much for being with us. And
thanks for having me, Eric. I hope more people are going to host these conferences because they're very important. When we're losing 3 out of 4 young people from the church, what could be more important than equipping them to stay in the church?